at Mission Gathering, sermons are meant to start discussions, not end them. And that's the case with many progressive churches. Really, that kind of set progressive churches apart from kind of more fundamentalist churches is there's not this need to totally align and agree with everything the pastor says. So if you disagree with something that I say at any point, that is totally okay. You don't have to feel like, well, this just isn't the church for me sort of thing. This is part of a discussion. That is really the history of Judaism and Christianity, is there's this ongoing engagement with the text and the tradition, and through it all, seeking to become more Christ-like people. And it's through engaging in conversation and seeing different perspectives that we learn and grow and become more Christ-like. And so today, we're going to engage in this conversation around Palm Sunday. It's really this historic day, the week leading up to Easter, this Holy Week. It kicks it all off with when Jesus heads into Jerusalem. And typically, the primary text is really looking at that story. But we follow what's called the liturgical calendar here. We really look at what's the lectionary. It's these assigned texts for kind of each Sunday. And interestingly enough, the text that's assigned for this Sunday is not that particular one, but it's another case that happens during Holy Week when Jesus is in front of Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate, he was this governor, he was this ruler, and he's the one who ends up making kind of the decision when it comes to what happens to Jesus. And in this interaction, it says that Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "You say so." And at that time, at the festival, this is the festival of kind of Passover, the celebration of the freedom of the Jewish people from enslavement in Egypt. And this was an annual celebration, and so it kind of came to be custom that during this time, they released a prisoner for the crowd. So anyone who was kind of, people believed, was wrongfully imprisoned, that this idea of, hey, this is a time of year where we celebrate freedom. And so it became tradition that somebody would be set free. And so what happens, it says, at that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas, which many of you guys have probably heard this story before. Yet, most of the time when we talk about it, we just say Barabbas. But the whole text actually says the person's name was Jesus. Jesus was a very common name at that time. And the interesting thing here is that with all of this, the author of the Gospel of Matthew, they are really inviting us as the readers to compare and contrast Jesus Barabbas with Jesus Christ. There's a key reason that they really kind of emphasize that the person's name is Jesus. They didn't just say Barabbas, but this is Jesus Barabbas. And so there's this choice that is presented here. But yet, there's another detail in the Gospel of Mark that is told to us about Barabbas. Most of the time, we just hear that one section that, hey, there was a notorious prisoner. And if you just focus on this one detail, you can kind of be led to think that, oh, this is just kind of a common criminal. This is someone who just had a big career in crime, who just had a lot of stuff going on. But in Mark chapter 15, verse 7, the other author gives us this one detail about Barabbas that I think is very important. It says, a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. And so this person wasn't just any criminal. This was someone who was a leader in kind of an insurrection against the Roman Empire. And so at the time, the Roman Empire was just had a far and wide rule, and they were intense. They were brutal. So much so that it was very common for people amongst the Jewish people to rise up and try to violently overthrow and violently take back their people and their land. And so there were many groups that sought to do this, and oftentimes when somebody sought to do this, when they got a group together and they developed an insurrection against the Roman Empire, typically the leader would claim to be the Messiah, because Messiah simply meant savior. And so this person typically would have claimed to be the Messiah, and so someone like Barabbas, Jesus Barabbas, would have been seen as a Messiah figure, someone who violently tried to overthrow the Roman Empire. But I don't know about you guys, but when I read this text, pre-2021, you probably wouldn't have thought much of this. But for most of us, when we see the word insurrection, post January 6th, 2021, you probably have a very particular event in our history that comes to mind, right? We all think of the events on January 6th, 2021, when we hear that word insurrection. Yet the thing is, this was a very different context. Like I said, this is first century Roman Empire underneath a dictatorship. And so there is a reality that, hey, these are two different circumstances. One is a group of people being oppressed underneath a dictatorship. Another is within a democratic environment of people who are upset that the democratic process didn't play out how they wanted, sort of thing. Yet if you look at these contexts, despite that there is difference in the context, both believed they were doing God's work. If the kind of the survey as people have been arrested post January 6th, a lot of them were evangelicals. A lot of them believed in Jesus. A lot of them claimed to be Christian. And so a lot of them believed that they were doing God's work in all of this. And as I'm talking about this, I can see a little shift in discomfort among some of you, because bringing up politics in church can be pretty uncomfortable, right? In fact, for most of us, over the years, talking about politics can become very exhausting, to where we kind of want church to be more of a refuge from that. And many pastors, there's kind of become a saying amongst pastors that, hey, we don't talk about politics, we just talk about the gospel, sort of thing, which is a totally understandable sentiment. But if you really look at the history of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the gospel was political. In fact, when the Roman Empire would take over a new area, when they would expand their empire into a new region, what would happen is they would come and they would come to announce the gospel of Caesar, announce the gospel of Rome, that hey, Caesar is Lord, Caesar is king, believe that, submit to Caesar's rule, and you now get to share in the wealth and the beauty of the Roman Empire. And then kind of a subtle, if you don't, then the full military force of the Roman Empire would come down upon you and your city. But all of these things, this term gospel was a political term. It was only used to announce a new king. On the Roman coin, it said Caesar is Lord. And so when the Christian movement started and people are saying Jesus is Lord, this was a political statement. This would have been something very countercultural to what was going on here. And ultimately, Jesus was crucified. That was something that the Roman Empire did to the worst of their criminals. And so this was all political, so to speak. I understand, though, why many pastors say, hey, we talk about the gospel, we don't talk about politics, because oftentimes it can be very divisive, the way things get politicized, where it just kind of becomes about kind of this different speech, these kind of catch-all terms that can become very divisive. And as Christians, we want to unite around Jesus. And so at Mission Gathering, we will engage in political dialogue, because I do think there's a reality that the gospel was political. And when we talk about loving our neighbors, there will be times where to love our neighbors, we have to oppose systems and policies that oppress our neighbors. But I think there's a reality that, hey, we will engage in political dialogue, but we won't really engage in partisanship. And I think that's what the kind of the heartbeat of what pastors mean when they say, hey, I don't want to get into politics. Because, frankly, I have seen some pastors be very partisan. My hometown, Temecula, where I live it's very far right, frankly. And there are a couple pastors in my neighborhood who every year or every election year, they release like, hey, here's who you should vote for. And they have like a very detailed, here are the policies here. And that, I agree, that is overstepping a line to be like, hey, here's all the exact people you should vote for sort of thing. How they've not lost their nonprofit status, I do not know. But this is kind of a reality. And so when we think about politics, this is not a left versus right thing. I'm not up here advocating for any particular candidate. I think we can all agree, both candidates are problematic in different ways, sort of thing. And so when I say the gospel was political, I don't mean, hey, the gospel advocates for a particular political party. So what I'm talking about is opposing certain policies, opposing certain systems that oppress people. That in order to love our neighbor, we sometimes have to oppose the systems that oppress our neighbor. And so all of that being said, when we talk about this passage here, when we talk about this phrase of the insurrection, that Barabbas was a leader in the insurrection against Rome, and it was tradition that one person would be released. And you guys know how this story kind of plays out. And so this notorious prisoner, Jesus Barabbas, who we are meant to compare and contrast to Jesus. And so they gathered everyone, and Pilate said to them, this is after Jesus being held on trial, and he says, whom do you want me to release for you? And so he knows Jesus Christ is innocent, and so he's thinking this should be an easy decision. A violent leader, or Jesus, who's been going around teaching, loving your neighbor, who's been going around teaching this ethical teaching, who's been talking about the gospel of the kingdom of heaven, and he puts them against one another. Who do you want me to release? Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who they call the Messiah? And like I said, the author, there's this invitation here. We're meant to compare these two individuals of what they stand for, who they are, what they did. And the governor again said to them, which of the two do you want me to release for you? And the story goes, they said Barabbas. Which, like I said, if you reduce this to just a generic criminal, we miss kind of the profound insight here of what this means for our world today. This wasn't just a generic criminal. This was an insurrectionist. This was someone who sought to violently overthrow the Roman Empire. And I think the people ultimately, they preferred the way of Barabbas over the way of Jesus. They preferred, when they looked at the dictatorship that they were under, and when they looked at what Jesus stood for, what he was teaching, and what Jesus Barabbas did in seeking to violently overthrow, they preferred violent solutions, such as insurrection, to the world's problems, rather than non-violent, loving solutions like Jesus Christ sought to accomplish. And the story continues on. So Pilate said to them, well, what should I do with Jesus who's called the Messiah? And all of them said, let him be crucified. And so there was such disdain for what Jesus was seeking to do that, just do away with him. We don't want anything to do with that. And there's this tendency historically, in hindsight, we always criticize what happens. But I think, frankly, we still tend to prefer the way of Barabbas over the way of Jesus. There is still this radical inclination toward preferring violent solutions over nonviolent solutions. We see this, of course, as I talked about in the January 6th insurrection, that many people who were arrested and spoken to, they aligned and they identified as evangelicals, as evangelical Christians. And so we still tend to prefer the way of Barabbas over the way of Jesus. That was kind of how they aligned more with Jesus Barabbas, not Jesus Christ. That violent way of accomplishing things, that violent way of overthrowing empire, rather than seeking to accomplish things through love and nonviolence. And on a more national level versus just kind of one incident, if you look at this map, you'll see several different dots there. These are the amount of mass shootings this year. In 2024, so far, a total of 159 people have been killed, 256 people have been wounded in 83 shootings. And so when you talk about violence, oftentimes the response to these sorts of numbers by different people groups is to say, well, we need more weapons. We need more people with guns, so that way, more good people with guns, that way we can stop the bad people with guns. And this tends to be the response. And so there's all of this debate, and once again, this tends to be something that is politicized, this tends to be something that is kind of argued about. And I don't think this shouldn't be a politicized issue. This should not be about Republican versus Democrat, but ultimately this response of looking at all of these events and saying, we need more weapons. We still tend to prefer the way of Barabbas over the way of Jesus. And if you think I'm just focusing on right-wing stuff, let's talk about these guys really quick. Because when you think about just not just national but international, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, how long and how deep-seated that is, the Obama administration has funded, in 2016 they signed a bill that funded $38 billion to the Israeli military. So much so that a lot of the weapons, a lot of the training, a lot of the uniforms in that region are American. And so a lot of the violence that has been perpetrated in this conflict has been funded by the United States. Like I said, this is not a left versus right thing. All of us as Americans, we tend to be culpable in this. We tend to have this inclination toward, hey, more violence, more weapons. That tends to be our response to the solutions here. And then more recently, Biden's administration just signed and funded $14 billion more to go toward the Israeli military. So a lot of the violence being instituted in Gaza is the byproduct of American funding. And like I said, this shouldn't be a politicized issue. This is not about Republican versus Democrat. This is ultimately about our human inclination. We still tend to prefer the way of Barabbas over the way of Jesus. We still tend to, when given the choice of non-violent solutions versus violent solutions, we tend to push and move toward the violent solutions. Yet, the gospel invites us into something different. When you look at the Hebrew scriptures, the prophet Isaiah in particular gives this beautiful vision. He imagines a day when we would turn swords into plowshares. And that image there is choosing nonviolent solutions rather than violent ones. That rather than picking up swords, that they would pick up gardening tools. To think through ways in which we can use our resources, use our intelligence, use our creativity to find solutions that provide flourishing for all people. And so oftentimes when we talk about these different things, like shootings, for instance, the solution should not be more weapons. But if the problem is mental health, then maybe we need universal mental health care. That would be a plowshare option versus a sword option. Or if the problem is extremism, then finding ways to dialogue, then finding ways to cultivate and seek to create systems that allow us to move away from extremism. This is ultimately the response, to turn swords into plowshares, to rather than to just pick up and fund more weapons, to say, how can we fund things? How can we move in such a way that seeks to change systems and create flourishing for all people? And in the midst of all of this, Jesus Christ, not Jesus Barabbas, his teachings invited us to love our enemies, which is one of his most radical teachings. Most of us, I would say, still kind of cringe at that idea of loving our enemies, especially when you talk about radical things like this. And when Jesus taught this, his crowd that he was preaching to would have immediately thought of the Roman Empire. Love your enemies, love the Romans. And so while many of his contemporaries would have responded with, hey, let's start an insurrection sort of thing, and many of those insurrection leaders would have been, some of them were called the Messiah, Jesus did something completely, radically different. And so this parallel, it's meant to be this comparing and contrasting. And so when we talk about Palm Sunday, that image of Jesus riding in on a donkey, that was a peaceful image. A donkey was a peaceful animal. Meanwhile, many scholars kind of talk about this idea that at the same time on one side of the city that Jesus was coming in on a donkey, Pontius Pilate would have been coming in from the other side on a war horse. And so once again, you get this comparing and contrasting of this violent empire with the non-violent love of Jesus. And my friends, we are invited to choose the way of Jesus over the way of empire. Following Jesus will be radically countercultural to the American way of living and engaging with the world that we are so often steeped in. Whether you're Republican, Democrat, or something else, like I said, this is a deeply imperial problem that so many of us are steeped in, that the response, our natural inclination is we need more weapons, we need more violence, rather than any non-violent, loving solution to the problems of the world. And so as we transition to communion right now, this whole image here, that Jesus did not get some military group together and seek to overthrow the empire. Rather, he had a small group of people that he taught to gather around a table. And in the midst of all of this, he said, "A new command I give to you, love one another as I have loved you." And that invitation, he was speaking to his 12 disciples, and you look at how diverse his disciples were. Oh my gosh. He had Simon the Zealot, and the Zealot was labeled a terrorist group by the Roman Empire because they were more kind of prone toward insurrection. They want to violently overthrow the Roman Empire. And then you had Matthew the tax collector, who, worked for the government. And so amongst the 12 disciples, you had someone who wanted to violently overthrow the Roman Empire and someone who worked for the Roman Empire amongst the same group of people. And in this context, Jesus says, "Love one another as I have loved you." And then he goes on to say, "If you love one another as I have loved you, the whole world will know that you are my disciples." To 12 people. And so, what if, just amongst this room, I imagine there are some diverse opinions here. Like I said, I saw some uncomfortable like shuffling as I was talking about some of these different things. And so what if all of us gathering around a table together, participating in communion together, being united under Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, what if something so simple could change the world? That through us loving one another, through us seeking to make a difference in the world together, that is something that could radically change our community, La Mesa, San Diego County, the world, that through a diverse group of people gathering together, loving one another as Christ has loved us, and seeking to ultimately non-violently love and seek loving solutions to the problems of the world, rather than constantly having this inclination toward violent solutions. And Jesus, he pours out the wine, which our wine is a non-alcoholic here, and he does all of this, and he calls this the new covenant. And this image of the new covenant, it was this prophesied idea in the Old Testament of the law of the Hebrew Scriptures being written upon our hearts. And so in all of this, there is this invitation to have our hearts radically transformed, to seek to live in unity together, and to love the world and love one another. And so let me pray, and then we'll participate in communion together. God, I thank you so much for each and every person here. I thank you so much for the gift of Jesus, the life, the teachings, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. And God, I pray that as we participate in communion together, that we would be reminded of all of these realities, of how Jesus invites us into a way of living that is radically different than the world around us. A way of self-sacrificial love, a way of nonviolence, a way of loving solutions rather than violent solutions. And so, God, I pray that in our daily lives that we would seek to live this out, that we would not retaliate, that we would not respond hate for hate, but that we would respond with love to seek to create flourishing and love in our lives, in our community, and in our world. Pray these things in your holy name. Amen.